I did say we would be returning to the T618 yet again this year, and Powkiddy, not wanting to feel left out, has entered the fold with another take on a handheld powered by the UNISOC Tiger T618. For those unaware, Powkiddy was actually the first to use this chipset a little while back in the X18S, which was a clamshell device that left a lot to be desired. This time around, Powkiddy returns with their third attempt and using a new form factor that comes in a pretty standard horizontal style handheld with a large 5.5-inch screen. I think for many there will be some hesitation with a Powkiddy follow-up to the X18S given its shortcomings. Now, does Powkiddy finally get the T618 handheld right, or does it suffer the same fate as its prior entries? Please join me, the Retro Tech Dad, as we find out if the X28 can compete in a very crowded and competitive space. Coming off the intro, let's roll with the specs first. As I briefly mentioned, the Powkiddy X28 comes equipped with a 5.5-inch 16:9 ratio IPS display at a resolution of 720 by 1280. It is powered by the UNISOC Tiger T618 with 2 Cortex-A75 cores running up to 2 GHz and 6 Cortex-A55 cores running up to 1.8 GHz. And offers the Mali G52 GPU. The handheld comes with 4 GB of LPDDR4X RAM and 64 GB of eMMC internal storage. In addition, the X28 supports microSD expansion with support for exFAT, so files larger than 4 gigs can go on the external storage, and something that is actually becoming extremely uncommon for a lot of emulation handhelds, so it is nice to see here. The X28 has the usual Wi-Fi 802.11ac and Bluetooth 5.0, and 2 USB Type-C ports. One is for charging and the other is an OTG port which allows for data. There is a 3.5mm headphone port as well as a mini HDMI out for an external display. It comes with Android 11 out of the box with Google Play support. Now, I pre-ordered my unit the day it was available from the Powkiddy website, and it actually shipped earlier than their release date of May 10th. However, it is available directly from the Powkiddy website for $149 US, but can be purchased for closer to $140 using the coupon code in my description for an additional $7.50 off. And the nice thing about buying direct from Powkiddy is that it does usually include free shipping. So Powkiddy is ready for this unboxing, and I do like this glossy Powkiddy logo they've got on the box now. I like the speckled effect the box has going on here, and it's a bit different than the usual Powkiddy packaging. Let's glance at the back, and nothing particularly exciting here, so let's just get into this box. We've got some foam overlay here, and I promise that this is actually the first time I am unboxing this, and this is how the plastic bag actually looked inside the box. So we'll put that aside for a brief moment and examine the rest of the contents. We have a fairly standard USB-C to USB-A cable, and a seemingly never-ending amount of foam in here. At least everything will stay nice and secure. Here's a look at the product manual, which contains information like product specs, and some useful information like shortcut keys and how to use the Gamepad mapper built in. And of course, Powkiddy's seal of quality with their QC control card. Alright, back to the X28 so we can finally show it off on camera and get it out of its plastic bag. I've got to say, this does feel pretty nice in the hands, and so I think with that, let's get to touring around the device. Starting from the top, as always, we have the stacked shoulder buttons, and I really like the differing materials they went with, having the shoulder buttons and face buttons use a glossy texture with the rest of the body using a matte texture. And so far, everything seems to be pressing down nicely, especially on the R1, which was really rough on my X18S. And the triggers, which aren't analog, do feel nice to press down on, and wow, what a huge difference this is from another device I've been testing, which is the Powkiddy X55, using a similar setup. Okay, moving on, we have the volume up and down buttons, 3.5mm headset port, a USB Type-C OTG port, a mini HDMI port for video out, a microphone, another USB-C port for charging, a microSD slot for storage expansion, and the power button. Let's take a look at how the left shoulder buttons feel, and just like the right side, everything is pressing down nicely, and again, no weird finishing issues. Nothing going on the left side, but I do like the curved grip that we are provided with here. Coming down to the bottom, and then finally on the right side, which has nothing worth noting. Let's check out the back of the X28 and see what's going on here. Now, it may appear that the unit has vents on the back, but this is actually just a design and nothing is actually being vented here. We've got the Powkiddy logo, and I do like that they've moved away from the actual wording of their brand since, well, it's just not a great name, but that's just me adding some additional commentary here. Other than that, this is a fairly clean design. So let's take a look at the front and check out what we have here. Starting with the select button, which is using a dome style switch, and then moving down to the D-pad, which is a nice size, and again, I like the contrast in materials here. So far, this is pressing down nicely, especially at the ends. The pivoting isn't bad either, and I will definitely be testing this a bit more later in the video. We've got the fairly standard Nintendo style switch analog sticks, which are very common in many of these devices. Moving along, we have a button marked G, which is to bring up the gamepad mapping in Android. And another pretty nice addition here is that we have dedicated Android buttons, and finally the left stereo speaker, which are front facing, and again, I do like that quite a bit. Alright, so let's check out the right front side and examine the face buttons. We have the start button in the opposite position of the select. The face buttons are presented in the Xbox ABXY style, and these do feel really solid. I gotta say, I'm actually very surprised, and this is a huge improvement over the face buttons on the X18 devices. This almost has an Ambernick feel to it, and these really do press down nicely. I think they have just the right amount of travel, I like the glossy finish, and testing each of these and they all press down properly, and when pressed down as hard as I can, it still sits above the face of the device. These also do look larger than some of the other devices in the category, which I will measure up soon enough. Again, we have the Switch style analog stick, and then we have two additional dedicated Android navigation buttons, which as I mentioned, I do like, and I think is a nice welcome difference here for this device compared to some others. And finally, the right stereo speaker. Alright, let's get this screen protector pulled off and get the X28 powered on for its first boot. And after a few seconds of the Powkiddy logo, we have arrived to the front end launcher provided to us by Powkiddy. Now this is sort of familiar, but not quite, as it is a little different than what Powkiddy offered up on the X18S, and it does look like it's gone through some refinements. Unfortunately, it seems about as disjointed as what was offered on the X18S. I've personally never cared for Powkiddy's Android builds, and I do hope that this gets some type of lineage treatment in the future. So you can see we have things organized on the bottom by the type of app. However, a lot of it is all over the place. The perfect example of that is going under the Games tab, where we have access to a sort of not so legal app store known as Happy Chick, which gives you access to ROMs, and then there's PPSSPP randomly here. But for whatever reason, all of the simulators, are under the My Apps section. Again, it's just a confusing mess and shows a lack of polish and thought. Now, most of the emulators that you would expect are on here for Android, but again, a lot of them are not going to be up to date or optimized, and for the most part, you will have to update and tweak things on your own. What I like to do in a scenario like this is to use something like Nova or Microsoft Launcher to clean things up and just have an easier to navigate Android experience and then work from there. In fact, using something like an alternative launcher such as Nova or Microsoft in combination with the dedicated Android hardware buttons makes it very nice to navigate and get around the operating system. I do like that we have a dedicated button for gamepad mapping, and I will be showing that off in more detail during the Android gaming demonstration. So when it comes to Powkiddy devices, it's no secret that a lot of their devices can be very hit or miss, especially when it comes to overall build quality. And I have to say that this might actually be one of their best built devices, surpassing even the legendary RGB 10 Max 2. The handheld feels light like a lot of the Powkiddy devices, but it is surprisingly sturdy. But what I find most impressive and probably surprising given the manufacturer is the overall finishing is quite nice. Gone is the awful black texture from the X18S that picked up every single fingerprint. The matte texture here on the X28 feels nice, but most importantly, it doesn't pick up every little fingerprint. I do like the glossy buttons and D-pad. As I said before, it gives it a nice clean look. The device is also quite comfortable in the hands because of the nicely sized grips on the back of the device, and despite the angular shape at top, everything is easily accessible and just feels good in the hand. Now, what drives me crazy about Powkiddy is the inconsistency from device to device. For example, I have the Powkiddy X55 here, which is a device released just before this X28, and the difference in build quality and materials makes you wonder if the same company produced it. The shoulder triggers on the X55 were especially terrible and incredibly noisy. I mean, it sounded like you were banging on a taiko drum, but over on the X28, they are quiet and feel nice to press down on. The X28 completely blows away their previous attempts at making a T618 powered handheld with the X18S and X18S Black Edition. The D-pad and face buttons are all leagues ahead of what was offered on the X18S. The finishing in particular is a very noticeable difference. On my X18S Black Edition as well as the original X18S, both had very obvious finishing flaws on the right shoulder button. I mean, just listen to the awful scraping of the right shoulder button rubbing against the shell here. But over on the X28, everything presses down nicely, there aren't any weird finishing issues, and this is definitely a massive improvement. Now, I don't usually spend as much time on this aspect of my in-depth reviews, but this was a genuine surprise. I have to say that Powkiddy has definitely done right here when it comes to overall build quality, and I do hope we see more of this and less of the jankier handhelds from the past. So moving on to the display, this does have a pretty large panel at 5.5 inches, and the only other device with a panel this large with the T618 would be the Powkiddy X18S. So this is definitely providing us with the biggest screen experience one can get on a T618 device. Now, I'm not 100% positive about this, so don't take this as fact, but I'm pretty sure that Powkiddy is just using the same 5.5 inch panel across a range of these devices from the X18S to the X55 and now the X28. Interestingly, compared to the X18S, I did notice that the color temperature was different here on the X28, with it favoring a cooler temperature versus the warmer temperature over on the X18S. It's always difficult recording displays, especially when they are fairly similar on camera, but hopefully it is visible enough for you to see. Now, the panel here is 720p, so things are definitely very nice and sharp, and the colors are not bad, but it's definitely not as bright as other devices I've used. But in the case of the X28, there isn't any issue using it in normal indoor lighting conditions, and the display does get pretty dark for those nighttime play in bed gamers out there. Personally, I like to keep the brightness at almost max, since again I do find it dimmer than other displays. Viewing angles are good as this is an IPS panel, so no issues there. It is very tricky to capture on camera brightness levels, but let's take a look at the brightness scaling here on the display. Finally, the X28 does have front-firing stereo speakers, and I do like the placement of these speakers as they are unobstructed by your hands and audio comes firing at you. These are definitely loud and punchy speakers that get a bit distorted when at max audio levels, but I can't imagine anyone keeping at this setting as it does get pretty loud. Here's a sample of what the audio is like at that max volume level. As I said, the sound does start to get distorted when pushed to max. Okay, one last part, and as usual, I'll head into Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and do a quick D-pad test. As I mentioned earlier, the D-pad is a significant improvement over the X18S, and in general is a very solid D-pad that is nice to use. I'm also finding it to be quite accurate and responsive, as you can see here in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I am able to pull off combos in succession without much difficulty and move around nailing those corners as expected. So moving on, let's get some proper measurements of the X28, and it will be joined by the other T618 devices for this segment of the video. Here we have the X28 joined by the other 2023 T618 releases, the Anbernic RG405M and Retroid Pocket Flip, and it really is funny to see all these three devices and how different they are from each other in terms of form factor. And now compared against last year's Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and the Anbernic RG505. And now the X28 compared against its older brother, the X18S, which obviously will not be as wide given its clamshell format, but it does rock the same 5.5 inch display as the X28. The X28 is definitely not the thinnest device here, and here it is compared to the X18S in terms of thickness. Finally, I somehow managed to get all of the T618 devices into a single shot here, starting with the largest in terms of width, moving from left to right. The X28 is the largest device here, and not surprising given its screen size and horizontal format. Alright, let's get the X28 on the scale and get some proper weight numbers. As you can see, the X28 comes in at just shy of 300 grams or about 10.5 ounces. Here's the RG405M, another 2023 T618 release, coming in at a little over 9 ounces or 262 grams. The newly released Retroid Pocket Flip, another 2023 release, and my in-depth video for that is actually going to be coming out shortly after this one. The Retroid Pocket Flip does come in at 270 grams or about 9.5 ounces. And here is last year's batch of T618 handhelds, with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus coming in at a little over 8 ounces or 235 grams. The revised Black Edition Powkiddy X28 coming in at 307 grams or just shy of 11 ounces. And finally the Anbernic RG505 coming in at 10 ounces or 286 grams, which makes the Powkiddy X28 on the heavier side, which makes sense given its 5.5-inch display, but the X18S still comes in as the heaviest T618 handheld. So let's get some numbers and measure the face buttons on the X28, which come in at a little over 7mm in diameter. Now compared to something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which does have the smallest of the face buttons for a T618 device, coming in at 6.5mm. And then finally something like an Anbernic device such as the RG405M coming in at about 7.5mm, which means the X28 finds itself right in the middle. I was going to measure the X18S buttons, but honestly it's not even worth it, they're absolutely terrible. And here's some hard numbers of the thickness of the X28, which comes in at a little over 17.5mm, and when compared to clamshells like the X18S here, which is just shy of 23.5mm, and the Retroid Pocket Flip coming in at a little over 25mm. Finally, the thinnest T618 device, which is the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which comes in at just shy of 14.5mm. So once again, the X28 is neither the thinnest or thickest device here. Finally, one last measurement, the analog stick cap on the X28 comes in at about 14.5mm, and these are larger compared to the X18S, and of course some of the others such as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which has some of the smallest analog sticks coming in at a little over 13mm. Now we can get to one of my favorite parts, which is tearing this down a little bit to see what's going on under the hood. I've got my trusty iFixit tools ready to go, and the backplate is using 4 standard screws. By the way, my smaller iFixit screwdriver and bit were just able to clear the space to get to the actual screw, so if you do plan on taking this apart, just be aware you will need a fairly thin screwdriver. Alright, let's quickly get these screws out of here. So the two pieces of the shell come together very tight, not leaving much of a gap to get a pry tool in there, so I did find that going from the trigger areas worked best for me. I got a plastic pry tool in there just enough to give me some separation and get one of those tabs separated, and let me tell you, these tabs are holding the backplate in really well. In fact, I almost sent it flying across the room just trying to get it off. And in case you missed that, here it is one more time in slow motion. And believe me, I had some not safe for YouTube thoughts when that thing came off like it did. So for anyone at home, just be aware that this is snapped together quite securely. Also, you will notice that the battery is attached to the backplate with the cable plugged into the motherboard, and luckily I didn't tear it out. Alright, moving on, with the backplate off again, I need to just comment that this is a fairly rigid piece of plastic, and just backs up how I feel overall about the build quality here. So let's take a closer look here, and we do have a 5000 mAh battery as I mentioned earlier. Part of why I like doing teardowns is showing how easily accessible important components such as this battery are to access, and this one is simple enough to get to and use a standard connector, which I definitely like to see. Here's a nice centered shot of the internals with the backplate removed. As you can see, we do have the main board and then the daughter boards for the face buttons and D-pad. The analog sticks are easy to access and user replaceable, so you should be able to put some Hall effect sticks in here if you wanted to. Here's a closer look at the shoulder triggers, and this is an interesting setup here, but I do like what they've done here as these are quiet and so much better than on the X55. And so that about does it here for this teardown. I won't be going further than this as I've done on some other devices, as the face buttons and D-pad are very solid to me. So moving away from all of the hardware focus, let's start talking about some actual software. One of the first things I always like to do is run synthetic benchmarks on any of my new devices, and going beyond that, I started to notice that things just weren't lining up to what I've seen on other T618 devices. Now, running my standard suite of tests with Geekbench 6, Antutu Benchmark, and 3D Mark Wildlife, I noticed that the numbers were not as I expected from a device with this chipset. At first, I thought maybe I was just not remembering the numbers correctly from other devices like the RG405M and Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, but given that the RG405M was so fresh in my mind, I knew something was not right here. And so, as you can see on screen, the numbers are pretty clear. In an unusual benchmarking chart, I've stacked it against the other T618 devices, and both the stock X18S as well as the X28 both underperform for that T618. In Geekbench 6, you can see that moving from the top to bottom, we have the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and Flip performing the best, with the Anbernic RG405 coming in pretty close behind that, which is what I've experienced in real world results. Quickly moving to Antutu Benchmark, and again much of the same story here. And finally 3D Mark Wildlife with similar results. Unfortunately, it does look like that X28 is not performing as well as a T618 device can and should. Now, this most likely comes down to Powkiddy's Android implementation, which is a real shame because Powkiddy has done a much better job on the hardware front, that to see it all come crashing down with this gotcha does feel all too much like a typical Powkiddy moment. The X18S also suffered from these issues with that stock firmware. Now, there's a good chance that the X28 might receive some type of custom firmware similar to what Black Seraph has done for the X18S, but there's no guarantee, and again, these tests are based on manufacturer firmwares across the board. So let's check out how the X28 performs during its battery testing. As usual, I've got Yoshi's Island for Super Nintendo here running at 50% brightness and 50% volume with the Wi-Fi turned on, and I was able to get over 10.5 hours of battery life. And for something a bit more demanding, here is God of War 1 for PlayStation 2, running at 100% brightness, 50% volume with Wi-Fi on, and it came in at just a little over 3.5 hours of battery life. Now expect battery performance to be slightly better with that Wi-Fi turned off. Finally, the last test here with some surface temperatures of the device. After running Honkai Star Rail for a good amount of time, the device never really got above 40 degrees Celsius, and on the back, temperatures were lower than that, so overall, the temps are pretty good here, and I do think that has to do a lot with the fact that we have a decent amount of spacing in the shell, so you're not as pressed up against the chipset. So let's get away from testing and play some actual games. First up, let's check out a few native Android games on the X28. Let's start with one of my favorite native Android ports. Horizon Chase obviously has no issues running here on the T618, but I did want to show off gameplay of this one running on the nice large 720p panel, which makes Android games a really solid experience. Moving on to Dead Cells, which is another favorite port of mine, and for this one I wanted to check the L2R2 in particular because this is a common issue found on the Anbernic Android devices, and unfortunately this issue does persist here on the X28. As I've mentioned before, you can remap buttons in Dead Cells, but this will not always be the case, and the L2R2 issue is definitely on a per game and per app basis. Again, this is why I'm hoping this device will see some custom firmware. Finally, let's check out a fairly new release to the Play Store. Here is Honkai Star Rail, which is a brand new game from the developers responsible for Genshin Impact. I wanted to use this game to also demonstrate the built-in gamepad mapping, which is very simple to use and does work pretty well. It's also very easily accessible by simply pressing the G button on the front of the device, which will bring up the gamepad mapping. So let's move on over to some emulation and start with something lighter and easier for the T618, which is some Dreamcast emulation. Here I've got Rez running with Redream, and as expected, performance is great, and again, I just wanted to show how Dreamcast displays on this 16:9 panel. Switching over to another platform that will run quite well on these T618 chips, here is some PlayStation Portable emulation with PPSSPP. One of the best use cases for a 16:9 device like this with a large 720p display is playing some upscaled PSP. Here's one of my favorite racing games, Outrun 2006, running quite well at 3x native resolution. It does have occasional drops, which does happen at certain points and is normal for the game. And let's check out a different game on the channel with some Dante's Inferno, which is a really awesome action hack and slash game similar to God of War. This is definitely a more demanding game, but here in the footage I have it running at 2x native resolution without much issue. So now things get a little interesting. Let's check out some Gamecube emulation in Dolphin MMJR2. Now with the T618 devices, I've always felt that it's just a really nice bonus that we can play Gamecube, and a surprisingly good amount at that. But a lot of games still do require some tweaking, so just be aware of that if you are new to this chipset. Earlier we saw that performance on the X28 is below its competition from the likes of Anbernic and Retroid, so I decided to go with F-Zero first to demonstrate this disparity of performance and why even the smallest performance bump can make quite a difference for certain games. Here we have F-Zero running on the X28, and as you can see it's not quite there, hovering around 80% and results in a not so great experience. Now let's shift over to the Retroid Pocket Flip, and you can see that it's definitely much closer to that 100% speed, and so the synthetic benchmarks are definitely showing up here in a real world example. Now it's not all doom and gloom, and of course there are GameCube games that will run on here, such as NBA Street 2, which I'm excited to showcase here on the channel. And another game that does quite well here on the X28 is Mario Power Tennis with some occasional hiccups. Finally, I wanted to show some Super Smash Bros. Melee and change it up a bit on the channel, as I've covered the T618 quite a bit, and so I just wanted to show off a different set of games here. Now moving on to PlayStation 2, the story is pretty similar to GameCube, except that I'd say PS2 is even more of a bonus and definitely requires tweaking. But again, I wanted to highlight an example of why that extra bit of performance can matter for certain games. Here is God of War 1, which I've become quite familiar with, recently doing a lot of testing with it on the Anbernic RG45M. Now here on the Powkiddy X28, you can see that it's really having difficulty staying anywhere near playable speeds. The Retroid Pocket Flip will be returning yet again to demonstrate the performance difference on hand here, despite using the same exact T618 chipset, the same build of Ether SX2, and the same settings. The Retroid Pocket Flip is a much better experience and definitely what I consider more playable compared to the X28. And again, like GameCube, there are still lots of games to enjoy on the X28 if you really do want to experience some PlayStation 2, but it will be reduced compared to the RG45M and Retroid Pocket 3 Plus and Flip. I just want to reiterate this fact so that in case you look at the community spreadsheet or look up gameplay footage of PS2 or GameCube running on a T618, just keep in mind that performance may not be the same here on the X28. Jingai, however, is an awesome hack and slash game that does work really well on the X28, and I believe it's the first time I've shown this one here on the channel. Finally, let's take a look at Celeste running on Skyline Edge version 69, and Celeste is one of the most compatible and stable games on Skyline, and it does very well here on the X28. Now I've covered Skyline quite a bit on my channel, looking at it on other T618 devices, so if you are interested, I definitely recommend checking those videos out, and again, Skyline can very much differ from one version to the next, and so this is definitely not a device I'd say you're buying with the intention of doing lots of Switch emulation. The same goes for Vita and Vita 3K, but more compatible and stable games like Uncharted Golden Abyss can do okay here on the X28, but again, you're most likely going to be sticking to much lighter games. So before we wrap everything up, I want to just take a moment and talk about the X28's bigger brother, the X18S, and compare it. Now, there is no doubt that the X28 is pretty much a better product all around, and the build quality in particular stands out when compared against the X18S, and it's definitely a direction I'm happy to see Powkiddy moving in, even though it took them technically 3 tries with a T618 to finally get a product that is able to stack up against the competition. And speaking of the competition, there's a lot of it in the T618 space. We have the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus from Retroid, as well as the Flip, and on the Anbernic side we have the RG405M and the RG505. And it really is amazing to look at the spread of devices because they really all do come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But unfortunately for Powkiddy, the out-of-the-box experience for both the X28 and X18S in terms of performance both do underperform compared to its competitors. However, I don't want to discredit what Powkiddy has done here with the X28. This is easily one of their best built handhelds, and if you are okay with some of the performance losses and are looking for a big screen T618 experience, this isn't a bad option. In addition, the Powkiddy X28 is around $140 shipped direct from Powkiddy, and devices like the Retroid Pocket Flip can start pushing almost $200 when factoring shipping costs and taxes. Ultimately, Powkiddy is up against quite a bit of competition in this space, with so many options existing with that T618 chipset, but it is nice to see them compete on a higher level, and having more options isn't necessarily a bad thing as everyone has different needs. I do hope that the X28 is an example of what Powkiddy will continue to do moving forward, and hopefully we will see more products at this level and leave behind some of those less desirable handhelds in the past. So what do you think about this attempt at a Powkiddy T618 handheld? Are they moving in the right direction, and is this something that interests you, and why? As always, this is the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.